All right, everybody, welcome to the property valuation section of the RTP Mastery course. As Kim said, I get to be her husband. I'm kind of the problem child in the relationship, so that's why she keeps me a little bit out of most of the stuff, but brings me in for my expertise, which is property valuations. So yeah, brief background on myself. 7 years in the REO world, 5 of that as a sales manager, asset manager, operations manager, actually looking at property valuations from all over the country. So not just looking within my own space within Salt Lake or when we were stationed in Dallas, but actually looking at valuations in Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Nashville, and being able to take all these different valuations from different areas of the country and reconciling them for investors. So at the time, the investor was the VA, or it was Fannie Mae, or it was Freddie Mac. And we were looking to recoup as much money as possible on their foreclosed portfolio. So what you have to keep in mind when you're putting this property package together and you're submitting just to get a valuation, or you're submitting any information to the investor, whether that's Home Partners, Trio, Dream America, and Divvy, even though Dream America and Divvy are little smaller companies, you're looking at sending information to a person that A, doesn't know anything about your market, or may not know anything about your market, to be fair. They also may not even be in real estate, and I think that's the biggest takeaway. You have people working that have been hired to process information through, and if you have somebody who, let's say, is underwriting your file and they've never been to your market, your value may seem completely off. The property may seem too unique for the area. So when you're submitting this value, as Kim mentioned with the package, you're putting together information and you're presenting this picture. But you also have to do a valuation that anybody can interpret whether they've been in real estate or not, okay? So that's the main thing that we're gonna focus on, and I'm gonna show you how we did that from the perspective of my experience as an asset manager, because like I said, we're looking at valuations from all over the country, okay? So the very first thing that we look at is location. And I know that if you're in real estate and you've been doing valuations, we have very standard distance guidelines. So if you're in an urban area, you want your comps to be within a half mile. If you're suburban, you can go up to a mile, maybe 2 miles. And then rural would be anything 2 miles to 5 miles and maybe even more. We're not really going to run into a lot of the rural issues with these investors, but you are going to deal with suburban and urban homes. Now, the main takeaway from this is, even though you're allowed to go a half mile up, we all know from our different areas that a half mile could mean the difference between $1 million property and a $200,000 property. You're the subject matter expert. That's how they'll refer to it. You're the SME, right? So you're the person that has to know your market. So you know where the train tracks go. You know where the subway goes. You know where the flight paths are. You know where the Air Force Base is. So you know all of these little obsolescent property valuation dingers that they don't know about. So if you're just drawing a circle and saying, here, I'm going to do my valuation within this half mile, and you're crossing a major freeway, you're going over train tracks, your value is going to be discounted and you're not really going to get the best offer possible, okay? So the very first thing that I do when I'm doing a valuation is I go as tight as possible on the location. So even though I'm allowed a half mile up to a mile, I'm looking at sales within that street. I'm looking at sales within the same block. And I'll expand out my location only if I can't find comparables within that super tight window, okay? So I'm actually placing that as a priority above property type, above age, above condition, because I want to see what's going on that street. And that's how the asset managers are trained. That's how they look at it, is they say, if you're going to send me a property that's worth $200,000, show me what else is selling on that same street. Because again, they may not know real estate, so they don't know that you can get a comparable home a mile away and it still supports value, okay? So you have to stay tight within your subject area. So that's what I do. I take my subject property, and instead of going into it and saying, I'm going to do a half mile radius, I actually draw a map and I look at the major intersections. So I stay within major intersections. I stay away from any train tracks, major roads, anything like that. And I draw this super tight window. And then I go back 6 months and I just say, let me see what's comparable within this. And remember, when you're looking at comparables, you're not trying to send over 50 homes that are supporting this value. At the end of the day, you need 1 or 2 that support the value. You need a sold comp. Ideally, you need sold comparables. Under contract comparables if you've reached out to the agent to find out what that under contract price is, okay? Stay away from actives. Actives is completely subjective. Somebody could list a home for $500,000 even though it's only worth $300,000, and until you actually have a contract and somebody closes, that list price is completely meaningless, okay? So that's the first thing we do, is we're gonna focus on location and we're gonna keep that proximity as tight as possible. Then we're gonna look at recent sales. Ideally, you'd wanna see only 90 days back, but they'll take up to 180 days back. Some places will take up to 365 days back, okay? So I'm gonna draw a really tight box, and then I'm gonna look 6 months back, 365 days if you can't find any comparables. Next thing we wanna do is we really wanna try to get apples to apples And here's where these investors are going to make it a lot easier for you. I should say, here's where the national investors are going to make it easier on you, because they have very specific guidelines that they've published. And that's why you want to really make sure you understand your investor guidelines. Even if you're working with a local investor or you're working with a seller, like, make sure you understand what they're looking at from a property perspective. Because if they're not going to take a property that is, over 30 years old, if it hasn't been updated, then there's no point finding a property like that for your buyers. But then also, it's going to make it harder to compare, because you're looking at homes that have an older age. And if you're in certain areas, you may be looking at homes that are 200 years old. And it makes it very difficult to compare that property, especially if you have like new builds in the area. So the first thing after we go location, we look style of home. And what a lot of investors want to see is as cookie cutter as possible. So we're looking at homes that are the same, like a rambler to a rambler. So we're looking single level living to single level living. If it has a basement, you're looking at homes with a basement. If it's a 2-story, then you could consider Victorian or Tudor homes, but typically you're looking at style being matched style for style. So I'm looking at a ranch rambler compared to a ranch rambler, okay? I'm looking at, even if it's like a bungalow or a cottage, bungalow cottage to a bungalow cottage, right? And if you're keeping that proximity very tight on the subject property, or whatever property you're submitting a value on, it's most likely going to have the same homes in that area, right? Because they've all been built at the same time, they're the same age, they should be similar style. And then the only thing that would vary would be some conditions, okay? So we've looked at location, style of home. Next thing we want to do is age. So your standard age is plus or minus 5 years of whatever the subject property is. So if the property was built in 1990, I'm looking at homes that were built up to 1995, down to 1985, right? So that 10-year swing is what an appraiser is going to use. That's what most BPO providers are going to use. And that's a good way to indicate valuation based on age, because the home is going to have the same wear and tear. It's going to have relatively the same type of plumbing, electric, roofing, things like that, okay? So I hope that makes sense. So that's where we're going to want to go. The only difference to that, the only exception I should say, is when you start getting to the older properties. So the way I look at them is I always go plus or minus 5 years, but once you've got to 1978, I'll do a bigger swing backwards, because 1978 is when we had lead-based paint, and that's when everything stopped right there. So I'll look at a home 1978, I'll go back to a 1965 or a 1960. And then as I get older with the homes, I'll expand that criteria by 5 years. So if I'm looking at a 1960 home, I'll allow to go back to a 1940. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Or I guess 1950 and then so on, 1945, 40. But as it gets older, you can have these bigger swings. As the property gets newer, you want to keep them as tight as possible to the same age of the home. Next one you're looking at is condition. So you're going to want to compare apples to apples again as much as possible. That doesn't mean that you're going to have to tour every single home that you use as a comparable and bid out their granite or their updates and see if their updates were done professionally or if it was a do-it-yourself. That's not the point of it. It's just saying that if you're looking at a comparable property and you submit it and it's been updated with, let's say, solid surface counters, right? So that could be granite, marble, quartz, could even be Corian, depending on what area you're in. But it's a solid surface counter. We want to compare it to a home that has solid surface counter updates. If it's one that still has the Formica, if it's still builder grade, you want to try to get comparables that have that same Formica builder grade throughout the home, okay? We're just trying to find condition, but it's cosmetic condition, right? So we're not going to compare our property to a home that needs a brand new roof, or a home that has some deferred maintenance that's really impacting the value of the home, like the plumbing shot, the electrical shot. Like, that's why these investors have their tight guidelines, is they want to have homes that are in good condition. In the event that the renter does not execute that lease option, they have a home that they can go market very well, or they can just turn around and sell, no problem, okay? And then the very last thing that we're gonna talk about for your valuation is adverse factors. And we talked about this a little bit, but like in our area in Utah, where Kim and I are, we live by the Air Force Base. There are some properties that are very stigmatized because when those jets come flying out of the base, you can't hear anything. The entire house shakes. I mean, it's just this massive, powerful jet moving through and you're caught in the stream, and those properties are very hard to sell. That's going to be an adverse condition that the investor should know about. And if I'm comparing a property in that area, I want all my homes to be located within that same distance or proximity from the base so that they share the same adverse condition. Does that make sense? If I have properties that are facing the street, it's a 35-mile-an-hour street, and all those, my property faces it, so it may not be as suitable for families with young children. Well, I want to pull comparables that are on a busy street or that back the same busy street, okay? So you're just looking at any adverse conditions to support value, but then you're also looking at any adverse conditions that may get this thing rejected. So whenever I write up a valuation for any of the rent-to-purchase program or rent-to-purchase deals that Kim and I do, I'm looking at, will this qualify FHA? If it won't qualify FHA, then we look at, is this even the right property to submit? And if it is, then we just support it with, again, homes that are very close, homes that are the same age, style, condition, and then watch for those adverse factors, okay? Now, as you go through the training, we're gonna have a bunch of bonus videos, and I jump into the Facebook group from time to time, so if you have valuation issues, you're welcome to just tag me on that, and I'd be happy to look at some of your valuations. But I have bonuses where I actually take a value and do my own valuation. I'll take a look at people's valuations that are students in the group, and I'll record those, and then I'll post those as bonus content so that you can see exactly how the thought process works when I put them together, and then when I scrub them from a student, because when I scrub it, I'm looking at it again like I did when I was in REO. I'm looking at it saying, I'm not in Chicago with you, but does this value make sense to me? Did you support this value? Okay, so check those out. That's the bonus content. And again, like I said, hit us up on Facebook if you need anything. Other than that, I'm gonna get out of the way and turn it back to Kim, and then I'll see you guys back to go over Trio more specifically as an investment strategy.